Hi, everybody. It's Dr. Patricia Coughlin, and I am back after a nice long break from work. And I wanted to talk to you today about the unconscious aspect of the therapeutic alliance. Of course, every therapist knows about the therapeutic alliance and how important this is for successful psychotherapy. And the conscious alliance really is made up of an agreement between the patient and therapist about the problems to be addressed, the goals to be achieved, and the therapeutic task or tasks that are going to be required to get them there. Well, Davanloo, when he began to experiment with much more active and direct ways of dealing with and overcoming defense and resistance, he discovered an unconscious healing force within the patient that was communicating with and collaborating with the therapist, even without the patient's conscious awareness. And it is this unconscious force in alignment with, and in addition to, the conscious alliance that really is responsible for the healing and recovery of the patient. We don't cure anybody, I would suggest. Hopefully, we're able to facilitate some processes that liberate this unconscious healing force within the patient. So let's understand what this is and then talk about how to recognize it and then strengthen it. So even though it was Davanloo who coined this term, the unconscious therapeutic alliance, and he first wrote about it in 1984, his concept of what it is, where it's coming from, was never terribly clear. Some definitions are very vague. One is an entity created by the patient and therapist that helps to expose the unconscious source of the patient's suffering. Well, obviously it's not an entity any more than the superego is, right? These are concepts and they refer to certain mechanisms, or I might say forces, right, within the patient's inner life, within their unconscious. And so over time, he seemed to equate the unconscious alliance with complex transference feelings. And it seems to me that as he began again to work assiduously on defense and the resistances that they create, particularly resistance in the transference, right, blocking the very process that needs to happen to promote healing, he often discovered that patients would have very complex mixed feelings toward him, right, toward the therapist. On the one hand, very grateful that the therapist is working so hard to help them, that they're not willing to be sidetracked or to accept half-truths, and yet also really angry and irritated that the therapist is challenging defenses and putting pressure on them to look at feelings and impulses and fantasies that they find, painful and guilt-laden. So it seems to me that this idea that it's the complex transference feelings that, in a sense, constitute the unconscious alliance, I think is mistaking the part for the whole. That complex transference feelings leading to very direct links to past figures is one aspect, one very dramatic manifestation of the unconscious therapeutic alliance, but I don't think it's the only one, and I don't think that the unconscious alliance equals complex transference feelings. It seems to me, and I could be wrong, that we have an innate healing force within us. We have an innate tendency or capacity to heal and be whole. Just as we have a physical immune system, I believe we have an emotional immune system. And that if we allow ourselves to feel all the very disruptive feelings that come up around both big and small traumas, we will be able to heal. And the real problem comes when patients rely excessively on defenses against these upsetting feelings. That seems to block healing and to really suppress this healing force. So as we begin to work to help patients see and turn on defenses, this unconscious force really comes into view. And I see it also as a manifestation of the two innate drives that Sidney Blatt talks about, that human beings have an innate drive from birth until death toward autonomy, to figure out who they are and what they're here to do on this planet, right? So being self-defined and self-directed is an innate force within us. And at the same time, we have another twin force of attachment, that every human being has a need to attach securely to others. And these two innate drives toward authentic selfhood and authentic connection are there even when buried, right, under just, layers and layers of pain and defense and resistance. So the more we can tweak or speak to the patient's innate desire to know themselves in an authentic way, to be who they really are, and to attach securely to others, the more I think we are going to mobilize this force. And it also seems to me that hints, evidence of the unconscious alliance is there from the beginning, just as anxiety and certain defenses and resistances are there from the beginning. So you want to keep your eye out, not only, again, right, for areas, of defense and resistance, but really for these openings. And very often they're going to come in, so we want to be able to identify them. They might be a slip of the tongue. I'm thinking of a man who came in because of depression, and this had been going on for about 2.5 years. And when I asked him, well, what was going on? Why 2.5 years ago that this started? And he just said, oh God, I feel guilty even as you asked me, because that's when my second child was born. Not that it has anything to do with that. Okay, so consciously, right, he denied it. He had no awareness. And yet his unconscious brought that immediately and let us know, without question, that very mixed feelings about the birth of this second child were very much a factor involved in his depression. And you can also see it, this is why it's so important for you as a therapist to be looking for, right? Because the unconscious often speaks in nonverbals, as well as listening for this unconscious alliance. And not just to be listening to the patient's conscious, rational verbalizations. So another example was a man who was quite defensive, and as I brought these defenses to his awareness, he became increasingly resistant, right, to the point where he was talking about therapy as a crock of horse shit, and he didn't know why he was there, and so on. So if you were just listening to content, you'd say, boy, is this guy resistant. And yet at the same time, he rolled up his sleeves and sat forward, just as he told me this, looking right at me, right? So his unconscious was saying, you go, girl, that's exactly where we need to be, right? On my resistance, right, against engaging, right? I'm afraid to hope. I'm afraid to try. I'm afraid to open up and engage. So this is very important for you to train yourself to see and to hear, so that you can bring this unconscious force to consciousness, and then that healing force within the patient is going to collaborate with you and give you all kinds of hints. Again, slips of the tongue, negations. One very dramatic one was with a woman. We were looking at her anger toward her husband, and she suddenly said, well, it's not as if I want to go into the kitchen and get a knife and stab him with it. Right now, that's as obvious as it could be, right? Or just because she says not, I said, boy, that was awfully specific, huh? So that's the impulse to go into the kitchen, right? And she went right with it. So really try to be attuned, right, to these messages from the unconscious. The patient isn't even aware that they are giving you these clues. And that's why Davanloo said there is an unconscious element to the alliance. And the more you can identify and strengthen both the conscious and unconscious alliance, the faster and the deeper the healing is going to be. So I hope that's helpful to you, and I look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.